Okay. The death of God killed truth and spawned a godless religion. In The Future of Religion, the pragmatist atheist Richard Rorty, along with the Catholic philosopher Gianni Vattimo, discuss Nietzsche's famous quote unquote death of God, truth, and how what they see as the death of metaphysics allows for religious belief without a belief in a metaphysical God. Their book maps out a faith that is supposedly free of this belief or any other tenets. So it's an atheist and a Catholic talking about a religion with no God. Sounds like a fucking paradox, right? Rorty claims that the end of metaphysics means being religious no longer depends upon intuitively evident specific metaphysical phenomena, like gods. He also claims that metaphysics dissolved along with the idea of the truth of being as identified with the manipulability of the objects in science. In other words, the idea that empirical scientific data determines what is objectively true about human existence died along with metaphysics. This opened the road for an anti essentialist religion. It is grounded on exclusively private motivations and is destined to realize the gospel that God sees us as friends, not servants. I'm not religious, but this is interesting either way. God sees us as friends, not servants. Did you hear that? The death of metaphysics allowed for a faith based on God being our friend, not our master. And it also reminds me of the idea of an immanent God that I've talked about before, right? This idea that the God isn't like this master, like old white man with a big white beard sitting on a throne in heaven, controlling everything, watching everything. It's the an immanent God changes is changed by us just as much as we are changed by God, and it's like a relationship in which we both have an impact on each other, and we're kind of more like friends of God that way too. It's not exactly the same thing, but a very similar concept. So I think that's interesting. So, because like this idea, like even if you don't choose a religion, even if you're not religious, I like studying them for reasons like this. And it's just interesting to learn about all these completely different approaches to what you just endlessly hear from these public intellectuals like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, as if this traditional Christian conservative narrative is all that there is to religion. But anyway, so Rorty points out that the idea of the death of metaphysics and God being our friend, not our master, we cannot try to legitimize these postmodern interpretations of Christianity because legitimacy is not something that any of us do in our own solitude. So a lot of people get triggered when I say postmodernism because they don't fucking have a clue what they're talking about. Jordan Peterson included, of course. But so postmodern interpretations, he remembered there's a difference between the postmodern era, the postmodern condition, and postmodernism. And he doesn't mean he clearly doesn't mean postmodern in terms of postmodernism interpretations. It seems clear that he either when most of the time when philosophers use postmodern, when they actually know what they're talking about, uh, they are referring to either the postmodern era or the postmodern condition. And I think in this sense, he means postmodern interpretations in terms of this being the postmodern era that he's describing, like the period of time after the Enlightenment. Um, so, so we cannot legitimize these postmodern interpretations, like meaning interpretations taking place in the postmodern era of Christianity, because quote unquote legitimacy is not something that any of us do in our own solitude. But that's not the point. Since our motivations for this godless religion, evil, are entirely personal and private, these interpretations don't need to be legitimized. If it works for you and it makes you feel good, nothing else matters. You don't have to legitimize it. Vattimo explains how hermeneutics, or biblical interpretation, remember Vattimo's Catholic, change reality by historicizing philosophy, change reality in the cultural postmodern sense, meaning metaphorically, not literally, as fucking dumbasses like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay seem to think is always the case. So this it changed reality by historicizing philosophy. This shattered the distinction between science and philosophy and became tremendously important for historical existence in the age of the end of metaphysics. I think that sounds cool. That's because hermeneutics proves the thesis that, quote unquote, there are no facts, only interpretations, is itself an interpretation. Vattimo says that this recognition was partially due to Christianity because, according to him, it introduced us to the principle of interiority, or essentially the world of inner contemplation. That's obviously a massive oversimplification at the least, right? But hermeneutics reduced the experience of objective reality into nothing but paying attention to and interpreting messages. So that's obviously still an oversimplification, too, right? Um, it introduced us to the principle. Oh, I said that. That's obviously a master. So hermeneutics reduced the experience of objective reality into nothing but paying attention to and interpreting messages. This philosophy freed religion from metaphysics at the same moment when Nietzsche accurately proclaimed the quote unquote death of God, which he identified with the death of Jesus on the cross as narrated in the Gospels. Nietzsche, of course, was metaphorically talking about culture killing the dominant theological interpretation of a single metaphysical Christian God who rules over everyone in the same way. Basically, new and different interpretations, but some that are actually older and have been kind of forgotten but then resurrected, the ideas that have been resurrected, basically new and old, and different interpretations, along with secularism in particular, got increasingly popular. If anyone today still believes in the salvation of Jesus' death, it's because they read it in the Gospels. No one in our times, unless you're Jordan Peterson, believes in the significance of Jesus' sacrifice because they think there's objective proof of his physical resurrection. They look at the resurrection as merely a metaphor for the salvation of Jesus' death on the cross. Vattimo argues that Rorty's anti-foundational or anti-essentialist pragmatism is only possible because we live in a society with its roots in the biblical message. Philosophical pragmatism asserts that whether something is true or not depends on how practically applicable it is in reality. I think Vattimo means that this practical interpretation of truth is only possible because we live in a culture that is still saturated by at least the remnants, not fully saturated, but saturated by the remnants, I would say, of the widely held belief in the objective truth of Jesus' physical resurrection. Rorty's less concrete and strict version of pragmatism, which is a way of oversimplifying, I would say, like that's my way of oversimplifying it, would perhaps not be considered as an interpretation of truth if we were not living in a biblical world that broadly accepts the idea of capital O, capital T, objective truth, right? So, because you might not even consider it. It's entirely possible that he's wrong, of course, but it's interesting to think about whether that would not have been considered if we didn't live in this culture, in this historical period, with all of the other relevant factors, right? So, anyway, pragmatism and hermeneutics became philosophies capable of overcoming the metaphysical logos, or truth as the capital W word of God, right? So this can take us toward a culture of dialogue no longer driven by the search for truth. Who cares about fucking truth? This is a new idea, like totally different from people obsessing about the logos like Jordan Peterson all the time, right? Capable of overcoming the metaphysical logos or truth as the word of God. This can take us toward a culture of dialogue no longer driven by the search for truth. We can all each create our own godless religions. We can all create our own godless religions. This is a good thing. We don't have to choose between being a militant atheist and a biblical literalist who believes in objective truth. These are false dichotomies. You also don't necessarily have to believe in objective truth to be an atheist. That's part of scientism to me, not atheism. Anyway, we can have our own approaches approaches to faith that don't require a noble search for truth and submitting to the authority of a divine, mighty, ruling, metaphysical God. So, Rorty and Vattimo see the point of this passage as positive. So, it's a good thing that the death of God killed truth and spawned a godless religion.